All right. How's it growing, friends? Welcome to Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. My name is Keisha. I am one of your co-moderators today. How's it going, Mandy?
Hey, Keisha. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad that we're back. We're here for episode 58. We really missed y'all. We're going live over on YouTube. So if you're logging on over there, make sure you send me your questions and I'll get those over to the team. I'll go through our list of social media where you should be following us. So if you're on any of these platforms, please follow us: Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Social Club. But you guys have sent in so many questions over the past few weeks and we still have those. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to throw it back to you, Keisha.
Fantastic, Mandy. Thank you so much. All right. We got Jason in the studio and Seth is coming in remote. How are you guys?
Doing great.
Good.
Doing pretty good. I just want to forewarn everyone, I'll be here for like a half hour, then I got to board a plane, but I'm going to leave my mic off and throw me the questions when you want me to say something, please.
Amazing. Glad to have you on, Seth and Jason. All right. We're going to just get into it. Ready for the first question, guys?
Let's
All
go.
right. I got a two-parter here from David, submitted it a while back. Here's the first one. If I want to determine the field capacity of my medium using AROYA, can I just super saturate the cocoa and wait 2 hours and then take a reading?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. We actually have a video on our YouTube as well with Ramsey back in the days that talks about a great way to basically check using weight and your sensors to get an idea of what that field capacity is for a specific substrate. So, cocos, we see a lot of varieties in between, say, 45 and 65% volumetric water content when they do hit that field capacity. So yeah, make sure that you are using a low flow to get up to super saturation. Then give it an hour, 2 hours or so. Probably the hour range would be good. And then take some measurements there. Check out that video we've got on YouTube. It's kind of a step-by-step explanation of a great way that you can check this with your specific media.
Yeah, it's honestly, you nailed everything there, Jason. It's super easy. If you've got a good hydration tech already for your blocks, which should involve a decent soak, not a 10-minute dunk or just a simple splash, just make sure you drain it off good enough and you're not having the block sit in a puddle when you do go take that test. And it's pretty easy, but it is very, very important. Just like Jason said, we see a wide range in between brands and even in between batches and times of the year in cocoa. So it's really good to establish that every time you start a new run, just so you know where you're at and you're not accidentally over or underwatering your plants from a distance.
Fantastic. And for anybody who's on with us live here in the Hangouts, I just dropped the link to the video that Jason referenced in the chat. And we'll also be sure to include that most likely in our blog post. But yeah, our knowledge base is full of great resources for you there as well. All right, let me ask the second question from David. If I get runoff at, say, 48%, does this mean I'm at field capacity? Or does runoff now necessarily mean that field capacity has been reached throughout my medium? Because I get runoff around 48%, but if I saturate my medium, my meter reads 67%. After the runoff stops, I'm around 62%. So is 48 or 62% my field capacity? Did you get all those numbers, guys?
I think so. Yeah. So we kind of wrap around some of the points that we made. Is one, let's make sure that this media either has been never soaked up before or hasn't been jeopardized by some low volumetric water contents before. And the reason we're doing that is just to make sure that we're avoiding any hydrophobic properties, any dry and wet pockets in that substrate in which the irrigation channeling could occur, where we're getting runoff before we've gotten to our field capacity point. Second part of that would also be, making sure you are using a low flow emitters. That'll also help avoid any channeling, those type of issues as well, and make sure you are getting up to a field capacity. Field capacity is usually going to be actually where that thing kind of likes to sit. Some of the time, if we're irrigating in a really good situation, we'll see runoff right about field capacity. That being said, if any of those caveats that we just talked about have happened, then that substrate's going to take a little bit longer for the capillary effect to actually soak all of the pore space in that media.
Yeah, and I want to highlight, we do spend a lot of time talking about how rock wool can develop hydrophobic pockets, and that's a big downfall. You can develop some of the same behaviors in cocoa if you don't do a proper job hydrating your media initially. So a lot of it really does go back to a proper hydration tech. Make sure you're where you're at and just keep testing it, Make sure you know exactly what's going on with your BWC. And probably if you hydrate 1,000 or 1,500 blocks, go test at least 10 or 15 of them. Get a good idea what your variability is going to be, because at the end of the day, especially with cocoa, we are playing a game of averages, and we can only control what we can inside the ranges that we have access to. So it's important to know that, maybe this first one hit 65, go check another one that might hit 58. See what we're looking at there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because, two things here is, one, I know we're always talking about hydrophobic properties in rock wool and making sure we're avoiding it. I don't think we talk about it nearly as much as we actually encounter it with clients. And so reiterating just the absolute necessity to start off with the best slate that you can when we're getting started with this grow cycle. Obviously, we also talk about, things like, hey, every day later, it's harder to fix changes or mistakes. Each day lost in production is one that we can't have back to have the optimal product. And so getting that idea of what your expected variation between blocks is helps you kind of verify that our sensor installation is good, and that any maybe of the crop uniformity issues that we're trying to analyze aren't due to other variables that we're looking at with this data. So getting a good sample size is absolutely critical. Great point, Seth.
Yeah, especially if you get some new media, don't be scared to explore it. Cut it open, dig it up, see what we're looking at here. I know different brands of cocoa over the years have experimented with different densities at different pot depths. Typically, they design that on purpose, so we hold more water in the area of the pot where the roots are going to uptake it. But it's good to know, because I've encountered pots where that hydration tech was everything. If we didn't let them soak for at least an hour, you'd end up with cocoa blocks that have a still compressed bottom layer or top layer that, you're not going to get it to completely hydrate just through regular irrigation at that point. And then that's a percentage of your block that your plant can't utilize. And if that happens to be the bottom 2 inches, let's say, well, if that's still hard and compressed, you've got like less than half the pot volume to work with at that point. And just like Jason said, when the later we go, if after transplant that's not fixed immediately, your plant's going to suffer the rest of the run.
Mikey's got a comment in on here. Thanks, Mikey. He says also always test a few of the cubes pots from each new batch ordered in. Inconsistency has been commonplace with most vendors. Absolutely. If you're used to using one of the specific vendors for 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, don't expect what you had dealt with and established as your standards back then to be true on today's order. So great point as well, Mikey. It's worth the time.
I love this conversation. Yeah. It's really about setting your own benchmarks in the first place, right?
Yeah. And while we're on that, we should probably talk about EC on incoming cocoa blocks. Cocoa grows in a pretty salty environment typically. So depending on the time of the year that the coconuts were harvested, how long it's been sitting outside in a pile before processing, whether they were rained on, as a grower, you'll notice at different points, even with the same brand, that initial hydration, the first time you give it another shot, your runoff might come off pretty clear. Other times it might be pretty dark red, brown. So when you start seeing anything coming out, and even if you see clear water come out, it's always good to get an EC reading off of that runoff and establish, if we've got 500 to 1,000 ppm in runoff of sodium, like that's not good. We don't want our plants growing in actual sea salt type water. So just check that, always remember, like anything in horticulture, as much as we, especially in cannabis, look at premium products that are pretty specifically designed, we're also paying a really low price point to process and ship this stuff halfway across the globe. So we've got to, temper our expectations and operate within that variability.
Yeah, that's a great point. It might be worth, testing that cocoa with RO and or with your nutrients and seeing what that offset is. So if I'm coming in RO at like 0.1 ECs, are we seeing that cocoa running off at 0.7 ECs? And take advantage of those measurements when you do your nutrient schedule.
Yeah, and to back that up, I have seen blocks come in with, over 1.0 EC in them in the runoff. It happens, and at that point, you just go, okay, we've got to flush. I can think of a few brands that I won't name that used to have it printed on their blocks that said rinse them 2 to 3 times with nutrient solution. And that's why. They weren't trying to be wasteful. They're just giving you a practical solution, and that would ensure that if you did that, you weren't going to run into a sodium issue with their media.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, it just goes to show you like the grower is always going to be super integral to this entire process. So I think we got some live questions over on YouTube. What's going on over there, Mandy?
Oh, yeah. You guys are commenting and asking questions. Broward County 74 wants to know, I'm curious if you have any recommendations for increasing terpenes and resin production through irrigation strategy rather than biomass.
Yeah. So, if terpene production is the utmost valuable, usually we'll go for more generative type of irrigation strategies throughout the plant life cycle. Those generative are the ones that typically see a response from the plant that's more potent in chemical composition.
Yeah, pushing that generative strategy is going to help focus on cannabinoid and terpene production, especially later in flower. If we've been able to, where our traditional bulking period, or not traditional, where our bulking period would be, if we continue to go more generative, bulk less there, so less shots in a day, essentially. We do see higher resin and terpene production. Another part of that equation is environmental. When we're looking at terpenes, it's a volatile compound. That's why part of why we're lowering our temps towards the end of flower. And that's currently, kind of a big battle with people, like not with people, but that people are facing. Do I run a higher temperature and not deal with mold? And then kind of we're all growing inside of a box now that we have licenses and buildings. So sometimes it's like, hey, I want to get my yield up, but I don't have the dehu capacity to run a lower temperature. And when we look at temperatures under like 75 or so in late flower, and then having the dehu to deal with that helps with those not gassing those terps off, essentially. And then a huge portion of that too, guys, is post-production. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, and even experienced this myself several times, where we went and hung up a crop and had an equipment failure in the dry room. And that loses it right there. If your dry room AC goes out in the summer and that sucker spikes up to 85, 90 degrees, you say bye-bye to your terps. It's a bummer, but that's just as important as growing good cannabis, curating it and getting it to market in a desirable form.
And I know the rule, don't beat up your buds. That one I do know. We do have another question that came in. This is a comment that came in over on YouTube. Let me know if you guys have any advice for this person. My pH runoff is a bit weird. Input pH is at 5.8. Output is at 4.5 EC. Input 2.8 EC. Output 4 to 5 EC. I'm in cocoa media with perlite, and I'm also going to put that in the chat right there.
Yeah, first thing I would do is go get a leaf tissue analysis as quick as possible on this one. Probably getting some buildup of specific elements from your nutrients. If you're using a known branded nutrient that's out there right now, probably 2-part salts if you're in a commercial scale. Get in contact with them, see what kind of recommendations they have for dealing with that. That's 1.3 EC or 1.3 pH lower than your input. Kind of my general rule of thumb is like 0.4, 0.5. Then I start to get worried if I'm 0.4, 0.5 high or 0.4, 0.4 low. Definitely something screwy is going on with how that plant is eating the nutrients in respect to the nutrient balance in the feed. So, if you do have miscellaneous supplemental that you're adding to a basic 2-part nutrient, make sure you're talking to your manufacturer about, hey, how could this affect what's going on? Also, check out your mixing systems. Am I getting some fallout? Is there a precipitate in my tank or in my filters? Make sure you're cleaning out your filters as well. So kind of just getting down to one, checking the basis. I would get a leaf tissue analysis out anyways, just because they're fairly inexpensive. It's going to take the lab a couple days to process that and get you the results. And hopefully that'll help you from spending too many weeks trying to deal with what this is going to do to your plants, which might end up in lockout.
Yeah, I mean, check out the whole situation. That's the reality. If it's a facility-wide problem and it's all of your plants, really look at your irrigation system. Go get your EC readings at the actual dripper and make sure you don't have a mixing or fallout issue or something else. If it is just one finicky strain, immediately get that tissue analysis. And then what we'll look at is like, hey, on this particular nutrient line, the strain, we might have to actually run at a lower EC with more runoff so that we're constantly correcting that pH balance every day. And at that point, evaluate, do we want to waste a bunch of water or require, one monocrop room for this strain to treat it special? Can we do that? Do we have a separate tank for that flower room where we can add what we need to or take out what we need to keep this plant healthy?
Yeah. And anytime we're troubleshooting anything, isolating variables like Seth is talking about is going to be the way to keep you from going crazy. It's so easy to kind of overlook some of the simple things that can make this happen, and dig into maybe something else that changed, even though we weren't maintaining something properly, or, some of the variation in supplier materials. Maybe that cocoa or the perlite coming in has bad wash on it, or changed the actual suppliers to the brand name. So, take the first steps that you can to isolate the variables, and that'll help you go down to the right path without wasting time.
And I want to stress to you guys, it's a lot easier to evaluate this if you have time series data going back as far as you can in that plant's life cycle. Because we could be talking about, a strain-specific deficiency, something wrong with that fertilizer. We could just be looking at, low EC in the beginning, some severe drybacks that, hampered its ability to maintain that pH balance. And then if if we went zero runoff for, let's say, 5 days trying to build that EC, but we started at 1.5 or 1.8 EC in the block, we had some really hungry plants. Trying to get that to stack, it's just not doing it because the plant's uptaking so much. So we're not pushing runoff and replacing that pH balance. So sometimes what looks like horrible plant disease deficiency can actually just be a simple irrigation problem earlier on. And then, the cumulative effect of small mistakes building up over a few weeks.
Thank you guys for that. Oh my gosh, that was a wealth of information. Keep those questions coming over there on YouTube. And then Bilbo had a comment, monocropping for the win. Yeah. That's it for over on YouTube for now. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Keisha.
Thank you, Mandy. Yeah, on the subject of kind of checking in on what's happening on a separate basis, somebody wrote in a question around leaf surface temperature. They were wondering what's the best time to measure this, and they were wondering if y'all have any recommendations on like a good laser thermometer. They wrote in, I've gone through over 6 or 7 laser thermometers and have even tried an infrared camera. There always seems to be big discrepancies between all of them, and I have no idea which one to rely on.
Yeah, that's a challenge that we all face. I always get calls from people comparing our equipment to other equipment. It's like, all right, give me the name brand, the model. I'm going to look up the that accuracy of that sensor. And if it's plus or minus 5%, then I have to add, the plus or minus 1% of our sensor on top of that. So it could be, hey, and maybe I'm 6% off in humidity, and these sensors are actually agreeing, which is very brutal way to start making SOPs and expecting people that don't understand this stuff to operate. But yeah, back to the point, as far as the time to take leaf surface temperature, we're seeing, I've seen some studies that suggest that there's slightly different amounts of transpiration throughout the day, talking about a little bit less transpiration in towards the evening. So as a basis, probably not within the first hour or the last hour of lights on. I would probably just take a few of them. They're fairly quick. Go across the room, take samples, in different places on that plant. Make sure that you are getting some of the top exposed leaves as well to see the highest leaf surface temperatures, the ones that are getting the most radiation to them. And build a quick T curve. If it takes 30 seconds to take and record a sample, go take 10 of them or 20 of them across the room and start to understand, all right, well, when I'm over by the HVAC system or when I'm closer to the mister, I've got a little bit higher transpiration. All right. Let's see the spatial variance across that so we can actually have a good standard of comparison. As far as which laser thermometer to use, if you can get one that has a NIST rating, that's going to be a good start. Typically, these are going to be substantially more expensive than a lot of the ones that we're used to using for industrial applications. But leaf surface temperature could be a fairly finicky measurement.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a 1 to 10,000 kind of reading. So it's a good idea to just get a feel for the light layout of your room and what kind of stratification of radiation you have at different depths. Because just like Jason said, those top leaves that are most exposed, those start going above about 85 degrees and we get some pretty undesirable effects. And another thing too to look at, the easiest ways to do this is going to be, right after your P1. It's a great time to go check everything in the room and get some readings. Personally, especially if I'm dealing with a light setup that I haven't quantified very much, I like to get it in the morning during that first hour after P1. And then in the afternoon too, and start to ramp, look at what my ramp is like in leaf surface temperature. So if early in the morning I go and see that wow, I kicked the lights on full blast and these are, 90 degrees leaf surface temp, and then they cool down 4 degrees after we get some transpiration, I might ramp my lights up a little bit to try to match that curve and not, keep that plant in optimum stomatal conductance.
Yeah. And I mean, so talking about things that are affecting our leaf surface temperature, obviously the room temperature is going to be one of the most influential aspects of leaf surface temperature, next to the amount of radiation that's hitting that leaf surface. Then we talk about the stomatal conductance. So how much water vapor is leaving these plant stomates. That's going to be cooling the plant down as well. And then in relationship to that P1 thing, actually substrate temperature. So the temperature of the irrigation coming in can change that plant leaf surface temperature as well. So quite a few variables playing here.
Great overview, guys. Thank you so much for that. All right. We got some action happening over on YouTube. I'm going to send it to Mandy.
Yeah, we submitted a poll to y'all, and the question was, what's more important to your success as a grower? So the answers were data, science, and both. And so data came in at 10%, science came in at 10%, and then both came in at 80%. So pretty important, both of them, I would say. And then, yeah, we also have some more questions rolling in. This one's from Anthony. He says, hey, I was reading a little on your runoff post on Instagram. I would love to get some info, if possible, on what I should be expecting putting in 6.0 pH and 3.0 EC, and how much water content I should be looking to finish the day off with the last feeding. And they're in 1 gallon pot cocoa. I'll add that in the chat.
Cool. Yeah. Good to hear that they're on cocoa, at a 6.0 pH. That's definitely a good range for cocoa. I like to be at, 5.8 typically, sometimes 6.0 for cocoa. Let's see. How much water content should I be looking to finish the day off with the last feeding? Going to have to answer that with what the field capacity of that specific cocoa that you are using. So as we mentioned earlier, most of the cocos we work with, we see between 45 and 65% for field capacity. Some of them are a little bit higher every once in a while. So if we are early in the plant cycle, we're trying to do generative steering, something like a 1 gallon cocoa, you might see about 25% loss in water content. And this is pretty important because if we are to say a 65% field capacity type of cocoa, it means we're going to be hitting 40% water content. Now, if our cocoa is going to be only getting field capacity at say 45%, that's going to put us at 20% water content. And so we may not want to push generative quite that hard with that specific type of media. In that case, we need to either get a cocoa that'll hold a little bit more water content or possibly move to a 2 gallon. Some of these numbers that I'm giving out are based on very rapidly growing plants, say maybe week 2, week 1.5, week 2 for generative steering in that flower life. So obviously if we're looking for vegetative irrigation, we'll want to be at a closer dryback to probably around 15%. And that, it's a little bit safer range if you are in a 1 gallon cocoa that has a lower field capacity. And sometimes we just have to run things a little bit more balanced if we don't have just the right situation to accelerate the growth of our plants as best as possible.
Yeah, I think you touched on something important, Jason, there, which is that dryback number is going to vary widely depending on plant size. I mean, even if we looked at 2 plants that were within 10 grams of each other, one plant might literally have leaves that have more stomata on it and transpire water faster. So when we're talking about those percentages, we want to keep in mind that, like, if everything is ideal, we're looking for that 15 to 25%. Plenty of options exist outside of that. So, really it goes back to your field, like you said, field capacity, figuring out how big your plant is, and then watch it and use, we can run some pretty big drybacks in cocoa, for instance, but data is key. If I can push it from 65 to 20, cool. But I'm going to moderate that and say, okay, what's my EC doing? My EC spikes from 6 to 24 when I do that. I might bring it back up at like 35%, not 20%. So, dryback numbers important if you're not seeing a decent one, but if you are seeing over 10%, really focus on your EC and then just watch your plants to make sure they look healthy. And one thing, we can't iterate this enough. If you're experiencing that low dryback and it's not a VPD or light related issue, you're probably going to have to correct it with pot size on the next run or incoming plant consistency.
Those were all really good tips. Thank y'all for that. I'm going to keep going down our list. This one's about lighting. Bob Farms wants to know, I'm really trying to dial in my DLI and trying to push my PFD, going from veg to flower. Should there be such a drastic drop in the DLI, or should I try to compensate the drop of DLI by raising the light intensity to match my numbers from veg to flower? So if my DLI in veg maxes out at 35, and I do nothing to my light intensity, my DLI in flower will go from 35 to 26. Please advise. Thank you.
The answer is yes. Do not drop your DLI through almost any part of the flower cycle if you can avoid it. So obviously daily lighting integrals, the number of photons that are hitting the leaf surfaces per specific area in the entire course of the photo period. So if we are at 18 hours for our lights on duration, we'll need to up our intensity 33% when we go to a 12-hour photo period. We want to make sure we're getting the same amount of energy to these plants. If we look at the very basic of plant growth, we're looking at the chemical equation for photosynthesis. We've got CO2 plus water catalyzed by light, and that's giving the sugars, basically the food for that plant to grow. And if we decrease our light by 33%, that's 6 hours, that being, the same intensity of light, so a lower DLI when we go into flower, you're going to lose a third of the amount of photosynthetic capabilities of that plant. That's definitely going to delay how quickly that you can build your flowers. And if you are in a competitive time frame for producing bud, then you're going to lose out on growth time.
Absolutely. And I think one thing to really bring up here, Jason, is that, when we're talking about matching DLI coming from veg into flower, we're not talking about going from, 450 ppfd all the way up to, say, 1200, right? We're talking about usually more like a 200 ppfd increase. So matching DLI, if your plants are showing signs of stress, look at all your other variables, but I know we've seen it proven out many, many times and grows all over that matching DLI works fine with healthy plants. You're not going to torch them with that increased intensity. However, if you only get 300 ppfd in veg, you're not going to be able to do it, or it's going to be slower. Just like Jason said, you won't have the total amount of photons and not as much photosynthesis.
Y'all, it's been so long since we've asked a great lighting question like that. Thank you for that. Keep sending those over. But until then, I am going to pass it back to Keisha for our online questions that we got in through Instagram.
Thank you, Mandy. Yeah, I love it. This is it's so good to be back on office hours. We love these conversations. Since we were talking about runoff and EC earlier, I'm going to bring up this question from Golfma. Wrote in, I'm seeing my substrate EC is lower than my runoff EC in week 2 of flower. That isn't normal, is it?
No, that's not that normal. In most cases,
it is if your substrate EC is lower than your feed EC.
Oh, yeah.
If you're going, my first question would be, are you using liquid nutrients and do you have a sensor in there? Because that's highly likely that's what's happening.
There it is. Golfma, let us know what happens. Keep us posted. I want to speak to a comment. Bilbo, you want to unmute yourself and speak to your comment you dropped here in the chat?
Sure. It's coming from having done it both ways, but having a place where you can log all the different decisions over multiple harvest groups really helps compare apples to apples. I have been victim of, sporadic information going into different systems and never really being able to compare information when I'm trying to correct in future harvest groups. And I felt like it was appropriate to just put it in the comments that, your information really is your key metric that you can use to, well, maybe it's not a key metric, but it's certainly a major point that you can use to affect your decisions in the future and learn from what you've done in the past. And I think that the platform, as it continues to expand, offers a lot of these places where that information can be input and really create a log, whether it's of an individual cultivar or an entire room if it's monocrop.
Yeah, I mean, totally love that comment, Bilbo. At the end of the day, it's really about growers setting the parameters for what it is that they're trying to achieve, and best based on your own knowledge, and being able to log your data just gives you the support to be able to do that. Really, the recipe, ideally, when you look back at historical data, right?
Yeah, but as a grower, you're constantly solving 50 different problems, from mechanical ones or cultivar environmental ones or IPM. I mean, there's a litany of problems that you face. So good record keeping, I found in the past, is usually the difference between a minor success and a major success, or a complete write-off.
Absolutely, Bilbo. I mean, I think you brought up something really, really important, and that's that we're all human. And we invented things like writing to help us keep track of information. And if you've got even 4 rooms in flower, man, you've cranked out a lot of crops in 2 years. And most likely you've got several runs with the same strains. So you want to be really good at organizing that data. That way, if you do run into a problem, you can actually identify it. I know I've said it here before, and I'll say it again. I've got all kinds of pictures on my phones with a date stamp, and man, I got to dig through some files to actually get any other details to try to identify what's going on. And at that point, that information is less useful and also more expensive because it's taking more of my time to find it.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. I have been hearing the term data quite a bit here in this episode. And really it's about information as well. So data is typically more easy to make comparisons, analytics, and have decisions based on large portions of it. For me, I started cultivating and I was just capturing information. This was all types of things like photos, time-lapse videos, and, starting to think about, how did this information get captured, get stored, and how to become useful. And I think that's one of the reasons that data is the first step, is because it's much, much easier to turn into a good decision. That being said, I think the best growers out there are taking pictures every day of their plants, of their cultivars, and making sure that, how the biology of that's performing is tracked visually as well.
You can take a picture quicker than you can write a note. I always tell people that it's so easy. And we have the technology now. That used to cost money and take some time. Now it's super easy to get all that information rounded up and put it in an accessible spot.
Yep, we have AV equipment in our pockets now, right? Bilbo wrote the comment here, qualitative and quantitative about the data. That's right. Okay, we're going to keep going with these questions here. Let's see here. Tyler wrote in, I'm currently using FloraFlex bubblers with 1/4 tubing and nothing at the end, open flow. With this setup, I can't accurately measure my milliliter per shot sizes. What would you recommend to add to the end of the 1/4 tubing in order to have consistency with my shot sizes?
So somewhere in there you need some type of regulator. So a pressure compensating emitter would be one of the most common options to do that. We always talk about low flow. That's really going to help the consistent or the uniformity across the rooms and give you a more predictable amount of water coming out of that system.
Yeah, so completely uncorked like that, you're probably looking at, depends on what octobubbler system you have. They're probably 20 gallons per hour. FloraFlex does offer inserts to neck that down to 2 gallons per hour. But personally, I would advocate just what Jason's saying, making the move to pressure compensating emitters and making your life easier. Or big beds. I don't know, big pots, big plants, and have the need for 20 gallons an hour or even 2.
Excellent. Great. Dropping some nuggets and some tips over here. All right, Mandy, I'm going to send it over to you.
Yeah, lots of questions about irrigation this episode. Oh my goodness. Wonder what that's about. We had another question come in. Key Capone wants to know, how do I get more root growth during the first few weeks of flower?
So a couple things that are going to affect how much root growth you have is, are we transplanting at the time of flipping to 12-12 cycle? Have we already rooted in veg? And so this is kind of where you need to think about the best rooting in principles. And so many times I've seen people running, like a Rockwool 4x4 on a 2-gallon cocoa or any type of mixed media. That is going to make it even more challenging to do that simply because of the different hydraulic conductivities and other properties between those two substrates. So think about how much complexity are we adding to the situation when we're trying to root in, and then really break it down into what does your rooting in irrigation practices look like. So, making sure that we've got our lights in check, our VPD is where we need it to be, all of those things going on. Then you can start to deep dive and say, all right, I want to make some small pulse irrigations just to keep that plant alive, but I'm not going to give it too much water because I don't want root stagnation. If we always keep that water content high, those roots aren't going to reach out and try and seek out the rest of the media. So typically we'll look at doing small irrigations, anywhere between say 1 and 4 or more a day during that root in phase, and then maybe even let a little bit of dry back for just a couple of days to make sure that those roots are getting seeked out. But it's a fine balance because obviously when we're transplanting, we don't have nearly the root mass. So we do have to make sure that we're keeping that plant alive with some water, but not too much, and making sure that it's working to seek the entire volume of the substrate.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Great tips.
Going into that, guys, a very important thing is a veg. If you come out of veg with weak roots, you're not going to have a good time transplanting. If you're in veg too long, the same problems that can happen putting a block on a slab can happen with a clone going into a 1 or 2 gallon. So I wish Jason, or I wish I had a whiteboard here. I know Jason doesn't have one behind him, but basically what we want to see in that root in period is that water content actually fall, anywhere from 15 to 20% over let's say a 5 to 7 day period, but we're not excluding water from it. We're giving it small pulses to help move oxygen into the root zone and stimulate root growth down into the block. But one thing to remember is if that block is at 70%, we've got to get some pore space in there for those roots to have oxygen and also seek out growth. So, like I said, I wish we had the line, but you want to make sure you get an appropriate dry back, but not too much. Same thing goes if you don't keep up with it enough and you dry back way too far too early, you're also going to hinder that root growth. So it's all about babying them, really giving them what they need.
I love that. It's all about babying them. We always look out for the roots around here. We also posed another poll over on YouTube. We wanted to know, how are you watering your garden? And our answers were hand watering and automatic drippers. And no one answered for hand watering, and everyone's on automatic automated drippers. So thank you all for that. I think that's it for the questions over on YouTube for now. So I will pass it over to you, Keisha.
So we expected those results because the people that are hand watering aren't able to have the time to fill out your survey.
They don't have time to log into office hours, right? They're too busy. Yeah.
Hey, a few of them have over the years. They'll get there.
They'll get there.
They like to be busy. Yeah.
That's right. Trying to make lives easier. All right. We're rounding out the hour here. Just to note to anybody who's on with us live, if you have questions for Seth and Jason, now's the time. So make sure you drop those questions over on YouTube here in the chat so we can get those addressed for you. All right. We got a question in here specifically about AROYA. John wanted to know, how would I reflect mortality rates of groups of plants? And I think they're speaking to in the system, in the AROYA platform.
Yeah. So obviously in the harvest group, you can reflect how many plants are in there. And if you are metric integrated, basically when you go from your clone lot to your tagged flower lot, you can account for the plants that were in the clone lot that don't get tagged. And that's usually going to end up as your mortality rate.
Yep, much easier to track with tags, but we are working on that part too. More and more analytics are always coming out. We're constantly refining the system to capture more and more data.
That's right. So stay tuned. All right. I got another question here. Charles left a comment on YouTube a while back and wanted to know what weeks are best to defoliate. Any tips on that?
It's going to be a little bit cultivar dependent. Most of the successful regimens that I run into are usually around week 3, and typically then later in flower, say a week, 10 days before harvesting, just to help the team keep stuff cleaned up.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to depend on your strategy and your sales strategy. Are you selling only jarred nug that's top grade? If so, we're going to go very hard, very early. Do you have a lot of market for extracts, B grade, joints, and things like that? If you do have that market for extracts, we're going to go more with what Jason was saying, right around the end of week 3, beginning of week 4, but it's going to be strain dependent. So instead of weeks, I'll just say the end of stretch. That way you can get out your tape measure and really figure it out. And then, at the end of that, ideally in our first default, we want to remove any buds and branches that we don't think are going to be desirable. That way we're not wasting more time growing them and doing more damage to the plant later. And then, after a certain point, usually that's, week 3 to 4 cleanup, we're not going to pull any leaves off of buds anymore. We're only going to take fan leaves that are connected at elbows and crotches. That way we're not, anytime you pop a leaf off the plant, there is an auxin response. So the more de-leafing you do, the more you're interrupting that growth cycle and telling the plant to take energy away from bud development and put it into callus development to cover up all those nice scars you made. So it's fairly conservative, but it is key to go hard at the times that you need to not get an overbushy plant. And then also, each run's a learning experience, right? If we've got a strain that we treated one way that's different this time, take those pictures, log it. I've seen such a diversity out there of having some strains that will fill out a table and still have rock solid golf balls like 1.5 feet deep in the canopy. They're just more efficient at transporting energy around the plant. Whereas others, that lollipop type pruning is very, very important. And one thing I like to stress with people with the defoliation techniques, grab your leaf and cut that petiole with scissors or your thumbnail. Leave just a bit of that petiole twig on there because the plant actually does have an adaptation to die back right there. There's what's called an abscission zone at that node. When you pop the leaf off, we actually disturb that abscission zone and again cause that auxin hormonal response where we get a little bit of callus, late flower that can cause some minor herming and re-veg type symptoms. So the safest thing to do is, again, just cut that petiole, leave an half-inch twig, and the plant will dry that back on its own and seal up that abscission zone. So you're not causing a hormonal response when you do it. That's the big thing, As the plant goes from its stretch period where it's got a high auxin state, it's pushing roots, pushing long structural growth. We want that to flip over to be, more of a cytokine, and there's a few others we can go into, but we're changing that auxin ratio, auxin to cytokinin. So inducing the plant to produce more auxin later in flower is going to give us more veg and non-finishing characteristics.
Horticulture at work. This is serious business over here. I also really appreciate the discussion around planting depending on what your product is. Pre-roll needs are going to be different from concentrate needs, which are going to be different from flower needs. So yeah, growers, you got a lot on your plates. Amazing. Mandy, what's going on YouTube?
Oh my gosh, what a great discussion, everyone. We had another question come in from Dr. J. Is there a training on your home sensors? I really want one, but I'm not sure how to read the graphs.
Are we talking about the Solus? I don't think our Solus offers graphing yet. So best way that you can do that is to obviously graph it on your own from that Solus device. As far as reading the graphs, check out some of the resources that are available from maybe your Rockwell supplier or your nutrient supplier. Right now, we're seeing both of those companies jumping in and giving great explanations. Look at some more office hours. We go through and talk about how this time series data gives you some indicators on what your plants are feeling as far as a physiological response to how you're dealing with them, mostly in response to environment and irrigation factors. And really that's going to dictate is how is this plant going to turn out morphologically? What are we going to get from what we're doing to it?
Yeah, and I think,
Awesome.
correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but sorry, I have to hit on mute, Mandy. I believe Meter Group does have a white paper on volumetric water content. I think that's one of the hardest things for people to grasp when they first start using our sensors is, traditionally we talked about saturation, not VWC. So step one, understand that and what it means. If you're thinking saturation and Jason and I are talking VWC, that's oranges and apples. They're not comparable, and you're going to have some bad results if you do the same kind of number application to those. The other thing, Jason said, start building a spreadsheet, make your graphs, and just have some good SOPs on when to collect it. If you can get a reading before you irrigate, after you irrigate to make sure you've reached field capacity and look at your EC. And then at the end of the day, that's going to be a good basic tech to start using those and then building some graphs in a spreadsheet. If you start using the spreadsheet very religiously, you may not need the graphs until you hit the end of the run and you want to actually look back.
Awesome.
Thank
Oh,
you,
and
Keisha.
Keisha found it. Oh, thank you. Awesome. Yeah. So we do have that on our site. But yeah, it's really all about understanding volumetric water content, you guys. Thank you all for your questions. We're going to keep going down our list when we have a few more minutes. Deer in the Garden wants to know, what EC range do you recommend for ripening?
So things usually get a little bit wild during ripening. And when we talk about EC range, obviously there's a couple ways to talk about this, and we'll take it right from what I talk about as uniformity, a snapshot right now of what things are, and then consistency. When we talk about a range, this is why time series data is so important. If I've got pretty large drybacks during ripening, and I might even be feeding it, say, half or 3/4 nutrients level, or have modified my nutrient schedule to reduce the amount of nitrogen, we could be feeding it, say, 2.5 or 3.0. We might see those ECs go way up. If we're feeding it something like 2.0, we might be seeing our reset ECs down at, say, 2. Maybe we're pushing a little bit more runoff. Maybe they're sitting there right there at 1.9, 2.3. And then since we're doing huge drybacks, our EC might be up at 12, 15, might be higher than that. And so as far as the range goes, it's kind of trying to define, is that mean where I'm at nominally for my daytime low EC? Is that my spike right before I irrigate the next day? Is the range that the amount between those two, or is the range, where I want to be for one of those points in time every day? And so it's kind of hard question to talk about. I do wish I had my whiteboard right here because I could circle those things and talk about it. Maybe I'll get a pin for my tablet here and we'll work off that in the future.
Yeah, we need to get a whiteboard in there one of these days. Yeah, this one's a lot easier to visualize than it is explained for sure. I just want to add it really has a lot to EC values in ripening have a lot to do with what the EC was at during growth. So if we didn't achieve a high EC earlier on in generative, we're not going to be looking for a super high EC. That's probably going to stress the plant. If we've managed to hit a pretty high EC, let's say like a 7 to a 12 during generative, and then we backed it off just slightly to more like a 6 to a 9 or 10 during bulking, and then now we've removed those P2s. Just by that nature, we're going to get a deeper dryback and a higher EC swing. But what you want to look out for is sudden spikes that go well out of the ranges you've been exposing your plant to. That's when we start to see, and it works both ways. If it spikes to 22, 25, that can be detrimental if we've been hitting a max of 12 the whole time. If it goes down to 0.3 instead of down to 5 when you water, like let's say you flush it out, we've got the same problem, that osmotic imbalance. And at this point in the plant's life, we're trying to push it into senescence. It doesn't change its root structure anymore. It's incapable of adapting very quickly to those changes. So that's something to look out for. If you flush it out or you spike it up, that's really putting the plant out of optimal production and also potentially pushing certain things that we've all seen, like herms, some other issues that we don't want to hit. And that's especially true with some of today's, rapidly being pushed through different types of crosses. You don't necessarily know when you get cuts if they came from, like, let's say a feminized cross, where a lot of times that high EC in the end will get you. So really, it's all about crop registration and paying attention to it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you're talking about, the plant life cycle, because basically what's happening is the plant's starting to learn an EC tolerance, right? And for anyone that wants to dive into the biology of osmotic potential or differential, go look up. If we get way too high or low in EC, these cells, the Tugger pressure is going to be affected by a hypotonic or a hypertonic situation. And, if we're achieving the right amount of nutrients, we're going to be pushing on both sides of isotonic as far as that osmosis goes.
I think you really nailed that one, Jason. You're teaching your plant to live in this EC range. That's the easiest way to think about this without trying to stress yourself too much about salt and sugar ratios.
Thanks for making it easier.
Thank you guys for that. And thank you for making it easier for us to understand that too. I think we have time for another question. This one's also about EC. The Inside Dope wants to know, I'd like a better understanding of why such a range of ECs are effective in growing cannabis, and also a better understanding into the plant responses to vegetative and generative cues. Any recommended reads?
To answer the first question, it's because cannabis is a weed. That's why it's very tolerant. It's one of the fastest growing plants that we know of. And so, as we've encountered the different levels that these plants can work off of, historically, people used to be definitely on the lower side of ECs. And a lot of it had to do with how we were balancing the nutrients for them and making sure that the rest of the variables were optimized. Now that we've made a lot of headway as far as the right environments and right nutrient compositions for these plants, the right light levels, CO2 supplementation, they can usually take a little bit higher EC than what we've seen in the past. So that's why they've got a pretty big EC range. It's very strain dependent as well. We'll see some strains perform substantially better at higher ECs, and some of them that start to do a little bit worse if we go too high with those.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out too, when you start looking at information in plant science, it's not that cannabis is insanely different than a lot of other plants. A big part of it is agronomy has been a huge factor in plant research over the last 100 years. So most of our plant research outside of, botany and really researching very interesting plants that we don't actually commercially cultivate, has been approached with the idea that we're going as low input as possible to achieve an acceptable yield. Well, when things are at a low commodity price, that's how we approach it. Fortunately for cannabis growers, the commodity price is high enough that we can look at using more inputs than traditional agriculture did. And that's where we get into kind of, if I came out of growing blueberries, for instance, every cent I put into the water counts. That's all money out of my pocket. Whereas in cannabis, I can, recoup some of those costs by having a higher quality product. So that's one thing to really consider when you're looking back at this. The same principles apply, but some of the values, just like if you built a greenhouse or grow room about 5 years ago, I'm always go back to it, small deltas. we weren't counting on that much biomass in a room. None of the other principles mathematically are, the equations themselves still work. We just weren't plugging big enough values into them for humidity potential, if that makes sense. So, read any information you can get on plant science, especially basic plant physiology, because that's where a lot of it does hold true with cannabis, especially if we're talking about osmotic stress. I'm going to avoid using drought stress, how the plant responds to infusion of oxygen into the root zone and what's kind of going on there. Understanding how plants work naturally is going to get you miles ahead in understanding how you're manipulating them and why they're responding the way they are.
Yeah. And, it's probably one of my favorite resources is university extensions as well. Meet up with the people that have been doing horticulture techniques for, the last 30, 40 years, and they'll point you in a direction of probably the level of information that you need. For me, I'm a fairly impatient learner. So sometimes I'll find myself on Wikipedia and I'll have 10 or 12 tabs opened up by the time I'm done reading one article. Cause it's I don't know what that hormone is. Let's figure out how it affects the plant's balance.
Yeah, there's a lot of basic online free classes about plant science that you can take and, not have to pay, like I said, not have to pay a bunch, do it at your own pace, and just, keep an open mind. What you're reading about tomatoes is still going to teach you about growing cannabis. It's still horticulture. We're just going to, again, adjust those values and the strategies a bit. Learning the science is key.
Learning the science is key. Oh, that was a good question. The Inside Dope said, love the education. Well, we love that question. I think that's all the time we have for that over on YouTube. So I will pass it back to you, Keisha.
Thank you, Mandy. Yep, this is all about agriculture, and cannabis is out of the shadows now. So it's really just kind of learning from other agricultural products. That's what we're doing. Amazing. All right. Got a write-in from Sean. This is on theme for today. I can't get my water percentage up over 30. I'm using 2-gallon cocoa with 0.3 drippers. I run it for 25 minutes. I get runoff, but percentage isn't going above 30. Am I doing something wrong?
First thing I would do is try to break up that irrigation into smaller chunks. Usually I try not to irrigate for much more than 5 minutes in duration if my systems are capable of doing so. And that's just going to help that substrate have a little bit more capillary effect. Those low flow emitters that you have are definitely helping. And then also, follow that link that we put in the channel earlier about validating the field capacity of that specific media. That is definitely lower than we usually see in cocoa, but we don't know specifically what model of or what brand of cocoa you've got working.
Yeah, try to break that up into 4 or 5 irrigations that are much shorter, and then hop on next week and ask us again. I think you'll have a lot better success getting that field cap up.
All right. So Sean, if you're out there, let us know how it goes. Okay. Do what our experts recommend. All right. I'm going to keep it going here. We got a few more minutes. See the questions we have left here. I'm not going to pronounce this right, but Gane Bosem wrote in. They want to know what our SOPs are for runoff nutrient disposal. What would you guys recommend?
Depends what you can do with it.
Don't dump it in the storm drain.
It's fun that I think a lot of us are sad to see what happens with the nutrients in an ideal world. We're hitting it with a UV treatment or a reverse osmosis treatment where we are cleaning out that water and reusing it with some amount of pre-levelized nutrients. In application, this has become actually pretty challenging for most of the people in this industry, simply because we begin to see nutrient imbalances, and recirculation is something where we have a lot more variables going in than we do when we're just feeding clean water and adding the nutrients that we know are going in.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on your scale, bioremediation is an awesome strategy, but if you're in an urban environment, that's kind of difficult. This is one of those aspects where the industry is really progressing quickly. So I think in a few years, we'd have a lot better answers. Right now, responsible wastewater disposal, follow your local laws, don't let water with an excessive amount of ppm go off of your property. Make sure everything's within spec for your state, county, and city that you live in. So wastewater plant or bioremediation pond is usually the two options. One thing that will be coming, though, hopefully in the next few years, is being able to convert that into biodiesel by growing algae. We're just, again, the industry is developing, and we haven't had this demand for IEC runoff yet.
Yeah, looking forward to more sustainable options as the industry continues to mature. Okay, I'm going to ask this last one that Kevin Perez wrote in, guys. Would there be a change in quality, in your opinion, if your drying takes about 30 days instead of 14 through 16 for the stems to snap? My understanding is that if the environment stays 60-60, they'll be okay. What are your thoughts?
Usually most producers that I work with just don't have the time frame in a production schedule in order to let things dry that long. It's probably, you're not going to see a huge difference as long as you're still hitting your target water activities in those plants at being at a, say, 16-day versus 30-day. And that's obviously a massive change in the schedule. It's going to depend on what you're doing with your cure process as well. Are we maintaining controlled environments downstream from this as well? And how long we're planning to cure it? So dry process, probably not a huge deal as long as the other variables are similar.
Yeah, if it's sealed up, right over here. Okay. If it's sealed up, you should be okay, but it's a lot harder to seal a 200, 400 square foot room than it is a tote or a bucket. So that 30 would probably be more like a 30-day or about a 14-day dry and 14, 15-day cure just on the stem.
All right. There it is. Big finish. Thank you, Seth and Jason, for joining us for hosting another great session. Mandy, as always, thank you for being my co-moderator. And producer Chris, we appreciate you. Thank you for everything you're doing over there behind the scenes. All right. Thanks to everybody who joined us for Office Hours today. We do this every Thursday. The best way to get answers from the expert is to join us live. To learn more about AROYA, feel free to book a demo with us, and one of our experts will walk you through all the different ways where it can be used to improve your cultivation production process. But as always, if there's a topic you'd like cover in a future episode of Office Hours, post questions anytime via the AROYA app, drop them in the chat, send us an email to support.aroya@metergroup.com, send us a DM. We are on all the socials, as Mandy outlined earlier. And then we record every session. We'll email everyone in attendance a link to the video from today's conversation. It'll also be on the AROYA YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and share while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, please do spread the word. Thank you so much, and we'll see y'all next time. Have a safe flight, Seth.
See y'all.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there.